Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Our broadcast today brought to you by Nature Box, shipping great tasting and wholesome snacks right to your door. Hundreds of options to choose from, like Greek yogurt pretzels and so much more. Support this show. Order your free Nature Box sampler box and give it a shot. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist is where to log on. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. For next week's show, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. It's a holiday week, and we're all busy running here and there, and I didn't have a specific topic in mind. And I've had so many people ask me to read specific stuff, whether it's an email or when the Halloween podcast came along, people were asking me to read different stories and whatnot. And I just thought, well, let's just throw some stuff on the wall and see what sticks. So next week's broadcast is called Please Read This on the Air. And I have no idea what you're going to send me. I mean, it can be an email, it can be a personal story, it can be a favorite story, a work of fiction, something out of Reader's Digest, something out of the New York Times, something that you wrote yourself, the phone book. I mean, I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm just going to pick some random stuff and read it on the air. So you provide the content, and I'm going to try to deliver it and deliver it up to your expectations. So we'll have some fun with it. It'll be kind of a lighthearted show, a departure from some of the heavier topics we've done as we edge into the holiday season. If you have something you would like me to read on the air, just drop me an email, podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. In the subject line, just put something like, read this on the air, and I'll know what it's for, okay? Tons of folks sending me this article. It's actually been out for a few months, but for some reason I'm really seeing the surge this week. I know Ken Ham even posted it on his blog this week. The article from Science 2.0 by Nuri Batachi that says, scientists say atheists might not exist. I had a religious person, a religious kind of an activist, send this to me a few months ago, and it was kind of an aha thing. Look, even science says that atheists really believe in God. I just love it when religious people latch on to a headline that has science in it and they throw it at you without properly understanding it, because that's normally what happens. And the article essentially goes on to say that we are pattern-seeking creatures. In the article, Nuri says this: cognitive scientists are becoming increasingly aware that a metaphysical outlook may be so deeply ingrained in human thought processes that it cannot be expunged. This line of thought has led to some scientists claiming that atheism is psychologically impossible because of the way humans think. I would like to hold up a hand of disagreement, if I may. Trust me, I do not believe in any God anywhere. I used to, but I don't anymore. Well, it's obvious that religious people, the theocrats, the answers in Genesis types, are going to jump all over this and say, no one can truly be an atheist, and science proves it. Well, actually, a true understanding of the article simply reveals that we are pattern seekers, and we are evolved creatures. There's so many different influences there. It certainly doesn't prove God or a specific God, your God with the proper name who belongs to a specific religion. That's a huge leap. But anyway, everyone's sending me this article. If you're interested, you can just go to Science 2.0 and read it for yourself. Scientists say atheists might not exist. I saw an article in The Onion I thought was interesting this week. It was obviously a reflection of the very real and very tragic story of Brittany Maynard. I don't know if you heard about this 29-year-old woman who was diagnosed earlier this year with incurable brain cancer. I mean, she knew she was going to die, 6 months or less, I think. And to receive a death sentence at 29, she's newly married and her whole life supposedly is before her. And her case went public and it became a lightning rod for debate over the right to die. I saw tons of people on social media talking about how her decision to move to Portland, where they have assisted suicide laws that actually are advocates for the person who is dying, to allow her to go out on her own terms. These people, these religious people, were aghast. Why would you take God's precious gift of life into your own hands? Suicide is a sin. Suicide means hell. Only God determines the number of your days, the number of hours, the number of breaths in your lungs. And to take this out of God's hand is an affront to all that is good. It was just a nightmare. In the meantime, this woman is essentially counting the final days she would have with her family. She had set a date of the 2nd of November. And on that date, she took a lethal dose, prescribed dose of drugs that put her to sleep forever. And of course, it's just a heartbreaking story. But it is a necessary conversation on a number of fronts, and not just assisted suicide. Of course, many of us are asking why a benevolent God would allow this horrible thing to happen to a young, precious life. Well, The Onion, not known exactly for reverence in these types of things, put out an article. Of course, if you're not familiar with The Onion, it is a satirical site. It's not real, but it's done with a straight face, and they are razor sharp. Put out an article a couple of days ago that said no one should have the right to die until God is done toying with them. Let me read part of the article. Life is a sacred gift from God. He decided that we should be born, and when the time comes, He decides that we should pass on from this world. We should be grateful for whatever precious moments He gives us. And no one, not even the terminally ill, has the right to die until God is done toying with them. It doesn't matter how sick you are. You don't get to die until God messes with you for a while first. Who are we to tamper with God's plan? Who are we to say that our suffering has become too unbearable to go on living when God, who's just looking for a little amusement, has weeks, months, or even years of agony lined up for us? Seriously, what kind of person ends his life before God's batted him around a bit? He made us. He deserves a little fun. The thing is, it's not up to us when we've had enough sickness. We don't get to choose when we'd rather not exist with Huntington's disease or a brain tumor. Oh, sure, we might feel ready to die. But for all we know, God has literally decades of chronic pain, dramatic weight fluctuations, and debilitating fatigue in store for us, mixed in with some occasional good days and maybe even some false hope for recovery. It's up to Him how long He'd like to be entertained by our helpless struggles. You see, God wants to take us on a ride. A wild, scary ride that He probably really enjoys watching from above before finishing us off, and we have no right to slam the brakes. Let's say you're 50 and have cancer. You're not entitled to just stop battling and die at a place and time of your choosing. Cancer is God's playground. If you ended your life at 50, do you have any idea how many promising stages of remission and soul-crushing relapses God would miss out on? Sorry, but this is going to take as long as the Almighty wants it to take. But the good news is, He always gets bored sooner or later. And once He's done jerking you around, then you'll get that death you want so much. You may think you've had enough of this world, and there's no reason to go on anymore. But for all you know, God's going to let you get better for a while so you can experience some more professional ups and downs and a disappointing second marriage before bringing you back around to your crippling illness years later. He might want to take you to the edge of bankruptcy a couple of times, or who knows, He might want you to struggle with someone else's death, maybe more than one person. I mean, this is why God made us to begin with. Life can be hard, it can be painful, but that doesn't change the fact that God created us and the world we walk on. And He gets to play with us for as long as He wants, and until He's tired of it. That may hurt to hear, but at least there's one thing you can take comfort in. It'll all be over eventually. A scathing parody from The Onion. I will include that in the description box of this show in case you're interested. I mean, when you look at it, it really does draw a huge circle around the perversion that is the religious look at God and suffering in this world. Was it Dan Barker who said all you have to do is walk into a children's hospital and you know there is no God, or at least no benevolent God. Just walk into a children's hospital, take one look, and you get it. And this kind of satire, I think, is effective in drawing a circle around it. Anyway, sorry for digressing, but I thought you might be interested in that since the story was hot in the headlines. Today we're talking about the Quiverfull Movement, a fascinating culture where having children is essentially the reason you exist. It's much more complicated than that, but I mean, that's what I took away from it, just a baby factory. We're going to talk to a reporter, a journalist, who actually wrote a book on Quiverfull, and then we're going to speak to 3 people who escaped the Quiverfull Movement. We'll do that here in just a second. First, I'd like to encourage you to take a second sometime today and log on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist with hundreds of delicious snacks to choose from. Healthy snacks with no artificial flavors, colors, or sweeteners, no trans fats, no high fructose corn syrup, and you'll find delicious stuff like mango orange fruit chews and the Lone Star Snack Mix, lemon pucker pistachios, Kung Pao pretzels, guacamole bites, Fuji apples, so many to choose from, and they ship it right to your front door. I mean, it just shows up at your house. You don't have to go to the store. They bring it to you, and it's a healthy alternative to the vending machine, to the sugar and the fat and the junk and the stuff that we normally do when we get cravings and want to find something to snack on. So check them out. Support this broadcast. Try out your free NatureBox sampler box if you've never tried them before. Just log on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Stay full, stay strong, snack smarter at naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Before I talk to my special guest tonight, I guess in a general way we should define Quiverfull. I'm going to lean to my guest to really give us the specifics and the details of the definition and what it's all about. But the general idea is that it is a blessing from God to have children. And so these deeply religious, deeply evangelical Christian families go out and they have a bus full of them. I mean, they're popping kids out like Pez. We're going to speak to some people who actually emerged from Quiverfull and can talk about it firsthand. But first, Kathryn Joyce is an author and journalist based in New York City. She's written the book Quiverfull Inside the Christian Patriarchy Movement. Became curious about it, and I had a chance to talk to Kathryn just a few days ago, and I asked her, how did you discover what this was all about?
My book, Quiverfull Inside the Christian Patriarchy Movement, came out in 2009, and I'd been working on it for about 4 years up until that point. I had started looking at the movement, or rather I stumbled on it very much by accident back in 2004, 2005. I was reporting an article about why at the time there were pharmacists, mostly in the Midwestern states, I think some around Chicago, and I think in Wisconsin, who were starting to deny birth control prescriptions. They were refusing to fill prescriptions for the birth control pill or other forms of contraception to women who were intending to use them as contraception. And they were coming at this not as I would have expected as Catholics or maybe as Mormons, traditions where there is a long-established opposition to contraception and family planning, but instead these were evangelical pharmacists. So I was pretty intrigued by that. I wanted to know what was it that was making these evangelical pharmacists who don't have necessarily the same theological opposition to family planning as Catholics come to this movement. And I started poking around, and in the groups of supporters of those pharmacists, I found the Quiverfull Movement.
I'm still stuck on the whole pharmacist thing. They get to choose who they do and do not prescribe or give contraceptives to. I mean, I'm lost here.
Well, that was the big debate, and that was about 10 years ago now, but there were pharmacists who were saying that it was a violation of their conscience, their right of conscience, to be forced to provide contraceptives to women who were using it, intending to prevent pregnancy. It was based in large part on their belief, which stands at odds with most accepted medical positions in this country, but their belief that birth control is tantamount to an abortive patient. Hormonal birth control, like the pill, actually functions to prevent a conceived fertilized egg from implanting in the womb. And now that's not the way that the American Medical Association sees it. There have been papers written about this, how it, in fact, does birth control work. But these were a group of pharmacists who were saying, no, this functions in a way that is similar to an abortion. And so therefore, it's a violation of our conscience to have to prescribe this. And that follows from some really interesting backstory that follows 1973 when Roe versus Wade made abortion more widely available. What followed were a series of laws that were designed to protect the conscience of doctors who come from religious backgrounds who did not want to be compelled to perform abortions. And most people recognized you don't want a doctor who is anti-abortion to be compelled to provide that procedure. You want somebody who believes in it and who cares enough to study it and learn how to do it right. But that sort of background in the right of medical personnel to make a conscientious objection to what procedures they were willing to perform or what sorts of care they were willing to provide. We were seeing in 2004, 2005, we were seeing the definitions really be stretched and expanded in interesting ways. Similar to what we saw with the Hobby Lobby case this past year, there was a broadening of the definition of who could be considered to have this right of conscientious objection. Was it just doctors who refused to perform abortions, which many judges and many experts who've looked at this find a pretty reasonable objection, or was it something like insurance providers who refused to provide coverage for that, or employers who refused to provide insurance that provides coverage for that? So this was kind of an early foray into that bigger debate back in 2004 and 2005 with these pharmacists saying, we happen to believe that these medications function in this way, and therefore we think it's a violation of our right of religious conscience to be compelled to provide them just to fill the prescription and hand that over. They thought that would be inducing them to sin, and that therefore it would be a violation of their First Amendment right.
It sounds very cult-like, It sounds like they got the walls up, the world is on the outside, they are protected on the inside, and there's a patriarch kind of running the show.
One thing that's notably different about that is this is something that's not taking place in one town or on one compound or in one church, but rather it's kind of a diffuse movement of people who have come to these convictions and are upholding them within their own little families. So I think that that's a little bit different, but I think it also has the result of you see a lot of difference from family to family. In some families, the exercise of patriarchy can be kind of almost in theory alone, that it's actually a situation where the wife has led the family into this lifestyle because she thinks that this is a more holy and godly way to live. But then in a number of other families that I've reported on, the situation, the patriarchy that the family is embracing can be absolutely despotic. It can be a situation where women have to submit a daily itinerary to their husbands. Their husband can approve how they're going to spend, every 15-minute block of their day. Their husband decides whether or not they're allowed to drive. Some of them belong to churches where the women aren't allowed to speak in church. They're not allowed to receive communion for themselves. They have to essentially sit and be completely quiet, second-class citizens within their church and their community.
So how do women get sucked into this? Are they born into it? I mean, how does someone end up in this situation?
A lot of the people I spoke to, a lot of women, said there was almost a slippery slope effect to getting involved with this movement. many of these women would have already been faithful conservative Christians, and maybe at some point they decided they were going to join a different sort of church, a slightly more conservative sort of church. And there they were influenced to the idea that, it's not such a great idea to have your children in public schools because they're being exposed to this ungodly influence. And so they decide they're going to start homeschooling. And then there's an interesting kind of the homeschooling world that has this whole other kind of infrastructure that if you're not part of it, you're not very aware of. But there are homeschooling conferences that travel around the country all the time, and they are very widely attended. And that, that's in the rural South. But, I also went to a big homeschooling conference right outside of Boston, Massachusetts. So it's really quite all over the country. But at these homeschooling conferences, a lot of the Quiverfull mothers or ex-Quiverfull mothers I spoke to talked about being exposed to a sort of like a holistic movement lifestyle. So they would go there looking to buy curriculum books to teach their children, and instead they come across the books of really far-right homeschooling publishers like one group, Vision Forum, that publishes lots of books about how, contraception is wrong. It's anathema to being a Christian, and if you're a real good Christian woman, you need to accept as many kids as God gives you. And then they also talk about what modest dressing looks like, and it's not just, not wearing low-cut shirts, but, sometimes it gets into very elaborate ideas of modesty that women have to wear head coverings and, all these different layers of shirts and skirts. And then it gets into the idea that dating is wrong and you have to instead instruct your children to go into courtship, which is sort of parent-arranged dating with the intent of and essentially an arranged marriage. So it's almost like there's all these different steps that women found themselves going on. So they get into homeschooling because they want to do what they see as being best for their children. And then they end up kind of adopting all of these other really kind of high-impact lifestyle choices, like being quiverful, like the idea that the men have to be the leaders in the home and the women have to be submissive. And so I think families just sort of get caught up in this, and they're getting caught up in a movement lifestyle that sort of compels them to take on more and more obligations and more of this ideology the further along they go.
Kathryn Joyce, author of the book Quiverfull, Inside the Christian Patriarchy Movement. And I will link to that book in the description box of this show. Now I'd like to sort of segue into a panel of people who escaped the Quiverfull culture. Katie Webb is an ex-Quiverfull mom who escaped in 2009. Her daughter, Jenna Bettendorf, 19 years old, is on the radio with us as well. And then Vykie Garrison, who was once a prominent member of the Quiverfull community. She once edited and published a Christian pro-life, pro-family newspaper. She did that for 16 years in northeast Nebraska, while home churching, home birthing, and homeschooling 7 kids. She left Quiverfull and started the blog Longer Quivering to provide support to women and kids who are escaping abusive religious environments and to inform and educate the public on the challenges faced by the spiritually abused. Thank you so much for joining me on the radio tonight.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Now, I've got 3 people on the call with me, and your voices sound pretty similar. So from time to time, when you answer a question, I want you to tell me who I'm listening to. Hey, this is Jenna, this is Katie, this is Vykie. Would that be cool?
Yep. Sounds good.
If I may, I'm going to start with you, Katie. You came out of the Quiverfull movement, and you have how many children?
I have 12.
On purpose?
Yes. 6 are biological and 6 are adopted.
Okay. Well, it's still an impressive amount of children. What do you guys do for a bathroom? I mean, is there a long line? Do you have to go through a schedule? How do you manage 12 kids?
Well, depending on the houses that we've lived in, sometimes we've lived in bigger houses and it's not a problem. And then other times, it requires some compromise. And it's only gotten difficult in recent years as the kids have gotten older. Teenagers want the bathroom.
Oh, you got teenagers. Now we're talking hormones. Now we're talking about attitudes and eye rolls. You starting to get some of that yet?
All kinds of that, yes.
And a whole house full of them. I mean, there's no way to run, Katie.
Right. Yeah, Steph, this is Vykie. I just wanted to say that, when you're in that quiverful mindset and that lifestyle, there's this huge emphasis on the fact that the teenagers are, basically a myth and an invention of modern times and technology. And so what we're told, and this was a huge draw for me, was that if you raise them right, if you raise them according to biblical principles, well, then they're going to have this very smooth transition into young adulthood. And so, they'll tell you don't have to do teenagers.
You don't call them teenagers. There's child and then adult and then
young adult. And basically, they're supposed to have this very smooth transition. There's not all of the turmoil of teen years. And so it's very much presented to the parents as something that is going to make this parenting thing very simple. I mean, you would think having a quiver full of children, you would say, wow, how can I handle that? But they make it sound doable. They make it sound like, well, if you got all these kids, but none of them are ever going to be teenagers, they're just going to smoothly transition into mature adulthood, then, well, I can maybe handle that, right?
Well, Vykie...
but those of us who get out and all of a sudden we do have teenagers, wow.
Do you beat yourself up? I mean, if obviously the nature of being a pre-adult is that you're starting to push back, you're testing boundaries, you are more and more at least craving independence. This is the nature of edging toward adulthood. Do you beat yourself up as a parent if there is some trouble in the home, if there is attitude? Oh my God, I'm not doing it right. I'm having some strife inside our walls. I must not be a good parent. Does that kind of conversation happen in your mind?
Oh, absolutely. And it happens very frequently that these parents who get involved in this quiverful lifestyle, when their teenagers get to that point where they're starting to ask questions, where they're starting to, think for themselves and come up with different ideas, and they don't quite fit into what the expectation is, of these mature young adults, well, then that is branded as a heart problem. That is branded as, sin and rebellion. And the rebellion might just be, for instance, that a girl thinks it'd be good to have a driver's license, or that she doesn't necessarily want to get married right away and start having children. Maybe she wants to go to college. It's just these very subtle things that it's not like they're going out and doing drugs or having sex or any of the things that parents would be like, teen years. It's very subtle things. It's very small disagreements that become huge issues.
Well, I'm going to get to our teenager here in just a second. I know you're hanging on here, Jenna, but before I get too deep into sort of the nuances of Quiverfull, I'd like to better define it for myself and for our audience. So any one of you three, do you want to jump in and sort of define what is the Quiverfull movement and what does Quiverfull refer to? Can you help me out?
This is Vykie, and I will give you an explanation of Quiverfull. The very basic premise of Quiverfull is the acceptance of the idea that children are an unmitigated blessing from God. And that is based on the verse in Psalm 127, which says, "Lo, children are a blessing from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward. Like children in the hands of a mighty man, so are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who has his quiver full of them." So that's where the term quiverful comes from. And it's kind of an unfortunate term because actually the majority of families who are living this and who have accepted this kind of worldview and lifestyle don't identify as quiverful. In fact, even America's premier quiverful family, the Duggars of TLC's 19 Kids and Counting, they just blatantly say that they are not quiverful. And it's easy for them to be able to do that, to distance themselves, because Quiverfull is not a denomination. You're not going to find a church that says, First Quiverfull Church of, Phoenix or whatever. But it's more of a mindset. It's more this fundamentalist presupposition that the Bible contains a model and God's basic plan for families. And so if you want to know how to structure your family according to God's way, you're going to find that in scriptures. There's a lot of emphasis on patriarchy, of husbands being the head of the house, wives being the submissive helpmeet. There is much emphasis on child training. You know, you have all of these children, and of course, if you're going to have half a dozen or more, you want them to be well behaved so that it's not completely out of hand. And so there's a lot of emphasis on strict child discipline. Most of these families will homeschool, and a lot of times they end up home churching. Everything is just basically back to the old paths, and they're getting their family structure ideas straight from the Old Testament.
So are you saying that Quiverfull is a label that was given by outsiders to try to define what this culture is like?
Well, interestingly, when I was Quiverfull, I was part of an online group called the Quiverfull Digest, but we never identified ourselves that way. And it was, I'm going to say, Kathryn Joyce who really coined the term Quiverfull when she was doing some research on another project, and she came across this group of women who are very modest in their dress. They're all homeschooling. They have a bunch of little kids. They're stepchildren, one every other year or so. And she was saying, what is this? I don't get it. And so she started investigating, and she kind of just came across this phenomenon of Quiverfull. And basically these families, they don't identify themselves as anything other than strong biblical Christians. But she needed to be able to make a distinction, and so she kind of just tacked that phrase on and called them Quiverfull when she wrote her book about Christian patriarchy. And because, obviously, it's a critique coming from a secular standpoint, when the Quiverfull community saw that book and started reading the reviews and hearing about it, they're like, don't want to be identified as those freaky, fundamentalist, cultic kind of people. And so they don't accept that title.
Let's talk to Jenna here for just a second. Now, Jenna, are you Katie's daughter?
Yes.
Okay, and you are 19, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And were you an unmitigated blessing from the Lord as a teenager, Jenna? Because I really want to know.
I think I was well behaved. I don't remember a whole lot from my teenage years, but I think I was well behaved.
What constitutes the teen years for someone inside a family of a dozen children?
Lots of responsibilities. We were living on a farm at the time, so it was our job to take care of the animals and babysit kids and things like that. It was really stressful, and I've blocked a lot of it out. But as far as my behavior, I like to think I was well behaved.
Jenna, you are a non-believer, right? You no longer hold to a deity, is that correct?
Yes.
When did that happen, and how did it happen?
That happened when I was 15-ish. Well, I guess closer to 16. So I just gotten out into the real world, got a job, and seeing how things aren't as scary as people are making them sound. And it wasn't really a conscious decision or something like that. It was more, it just kind of happened, and it was really scary, and I was like, oh no, what's happening? I actually kind of dabbled in Catholicism for a second because I was terrified that I was losing my faith. And
Catholicism was like your gateway to atheism.
Kind of.
I need something where I don't have to really believe much and do much. I think I'll try Catholicism. I mean, was it something like that?
I was thinking I needed more structure, more dogma. And,
I see.
So I kind of tried that. I got a rosary and everything, and no, that didn't help. But I was terrified that I was losing my faith, and so I tried that, and it didn't work. I eventually just came to terms with it, and I was still pretty secretive about it for, I guess, until I was like 18. I didn't really tell anyone about it.
Well, how does Mom Katie handle that? Does that rattle your cage quite a bit, Katie?
Well, we had already departed so far from the radical conservative Christian movement. And I want to back up for just a second and kind of piggyback on something that Vykie had said, because it'll help you understand my approach toward Jenna and teenagers now. She mentioned that, you need to really control your kids. And I think that as we were coming into the Quiverfull movement, our kids were young and we could control them with basic fear. And when they did start hitting those teenage years and questioning things, that was why I eventually left. When Jenna was 13, she was talking daily about running away because it was so oppressive. And as a really independent, strong woman that she is now, that was showing up at 13. And I was terrified I was going to lose my kids.
Well, Katie, I mean, help me out. Was it fear of what? The back of somebody's hand? Was it fear of hell? What was she afraid of?
Oh, they were absolutely fearful of the back of somebody's hand. Yeah. Yeah, we were very punitive. Michael Pearl, spare the rod, spoil the child.
There was spanking. There was all of that in the home, and it was pretty intense, yes?
Absolutely. It was physical intimidation was what kept the kids in line.
Well, you're a mom, right? You're supposed to protect your kids. What's going on in your mind? Are you thinking, spare the rod, spoil the child, this is tough love? Or are you wounded every time you see a spanking or some sort of corporal punishment take place?
Well, it wasn't fun. We weren't jumping up and down for joy that we were beating our children, but we felt we were called to do it. And not every Quiverfull family works that way. Some are more punitive than others, but there does come a point where, yeah, there will be chaos in the home unless you're controlling these children. And it's easy to do when they're smaller than you. But as they get older, it becomes far more difficult. So that was one of the issues that we were having, that, you know, the boys were getting older, and I saw the anger, and I thought, you know, someday this is going to get really ugly when I can't just dominate them by force, and my ex-husband can't dominate them by force. And I knew something needed to change, and I was able to look around at other Quiverfull families and see their older children leaving one by one. And if you know, the families that continue to hold to the strict Quiverfull patriarchal mindset were losing their children. So that was what eventually led me to get rid of the entire part and parcel. And we lived with one foot in each world for quite a while. I mean, I evicted the abusive husband, but then we did try to live this still conservative Christian lifestyle and Quiverfull lifestyle with all of our old friends who weren't accepting. But then the mainstream world also wasn't accepting of us. And we did that for several years. So when Jenna came completely out of that and became comfortable in her own skin and comfortable in the world and was being successful and happy, I was thrilled for her. And I was past the point of questioning whether it was right or good or biblical, or I just didn't want her in distress.
Yeah, it was hers, and she was happy, and that was enough for you.
Yes, yes.
I'm talking here with Katie Webb. She is an ex-Quiverfull mother of 12. Her daughter Jenna is on the line with us, and Vykie Garrison, who started the blog No Longer Quivering, who is also a product of that community. Vykie, is abuse from the patriarch common denominator in these environments? Verbal, physical, any type of abuse? Is this a thing?
It is actually very common, and I would say because patriarchy involves such an extreme imbalance of power, and because there is no equality there, the very definition is that the husband is going to be the leader. He's going to be the head, and by that, it grants him so much more power than the wife and the children. That is a setup for an inherently abusive approach to relationships. And so, you know, at the very foundation of this relational model, you have abuse, definitely emotional, definitely the mental abuse, because it's based on the idea that one person has a special place with God. God has made this man the very special person whom he works through, and everyone else needs to line up under his authority. And by granting the father that kind of authority over his wife and over his children, you're setting him up to become a tyrant. And what I found is very interesting through working with the women who come to No Longer Quivering is that the men who go for this, you know, when you first come across these ideals, the men who really go for it are the ones who already had a controlling tendency. who already had some relational problems anyway. The men who are looking for a full equal partner, the men who already have emotionally healthy styles of relating to begin with, when they're presented with this idea that, of headship and submission and of saying you're the one who is supposed to be spiritually responsible for your family and this is God's will, basically they look at that and they say, no thanks. I'm not really looking for a doormat. I'm not really looking for, I want somebody who is equal to me, who is going to be a partner and, share in the responsibilities and the authority, et cetera. And so it tends to be that the families who are already kind of sucking at their relationships, they're the ones that really are drawn in because it gives kind of biblical sanction to what they're already doing.
Well, Vykie, I had a chance to have a conversation with a devoutly Christian mother of like 4 or 5. She's not anything like the Quiverfulls. She's just a basic conservative Christian. And the subject of man's headship over the house and the Bible's opinion about women, the voice of women, the authority of women came up. And she was more than happy to say, you know what, I don't need to make the big decisions. I mean, I'm willing to trust God. I'm willing to trust my husband. To her, she appeared to, on the surface, to have comfort giving all of that power up to somebody else. And I'm not really sure what drives that. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Well, I think that a lot of times women find it appealing because there is sort of this way of abnegating your responsibility, not having to make those big decisions. It's kind of a cop-out to be able to say, well, let him figure that out because God has given him special revelation or whatever. God is speaking through him. And so what it basically comes down to, and of course, when I was doing it, all of these women that I talked to who have come out of it, all the women I talked to who are still in it, not one of us would say, well, we just don't want to have to have that responsibility. We just don't want to have to make a decision. But when it comes down to the actual fact, a lot of times women feel overwhelmed. They feel like, I don't even know really how to make a good decision. I'm not, I don't have those skills. And so it's really easy to say, let him go ahead. It was interesting because in my marriage, my husband was not much of a leader, and I'm very much, I can make a decision. It's not really a problem for me. But the decisions that we're talking about, like whether or not to bring another living being who we believe would exist eternally into existence, that's a huge, huge decision. And that's something that I did not want to have to make. And so then it was really easy to say, well, here's what the Bible says, and this is God's way, and, it's his choice. And so, yeah.
Wait a minute, though. I mean, wait a minute. Is it a decision, or is it the kind of thing where there's no contraception and it's all up to God anyway? Is there a decision process?
Well, you're making the decision not to have a choice about it. You choose not to have a choice. Because if I say I'm going to trust God, then it's his thing, right, whether or not I get pregnant. And, of course, I'm not going to interfere one way or the other because I'm leaving that up to God. So it's basically kind of letting nature take its course, but we're calling that God.
So every time you have intimacy with your partner, you are essentially rolling the dice, not rolling the dice. You believe that God will decide if you need to bring another life into this world, correct?
Yes. Yes, and it was it's definitely, it's not like we thought we were leaving it up to chance. We were definitely leaving it up to God, and we believe that there's this outside higher power, almighty creator God who is deciding whether or not to bring a new soul into existence.
Well, all right, Katie, you go to your partner, you go to your husband, and you say, I'd like to use contraception. I'm not ready to have another child. And that conversation goes over how?
Well, going along with what Vykie said, as far as, if you're, and I observed this as well, when I would approach people that were in healthy egalitarian marriages and say, hey, look at this fabulous quiverful lifestyle where you can be completely submissive to your husband and never question anything he says, they'd look at me like I was crazy, whether they were Christian or not. I think the Quiverfull lifestyle and the patriarchy is really a lot of times matriarchal driven. The families I've known that have really strongly embraced it already had, like Vykie said, sucky marriages. And we were looking for something to fix it. When you tried marital counseling and you've tried reading this book and that book, and then along comes Debbie Pearl's book that says you can have a glorious marriage if you do these things, submit in everything. And then it just snowballs from there. Okay, we're submitting in everything. Okay, now I'm a part of these online forums where they're saying not only do you do that, but then you don't use birth control. And not only do you do that, but you need to homestead. And not only do you do that, but you bake all your bread from scratch or whatever, and you're constantly looking for the thing to fix the problem, and it's unfixable. In my situation, it was never a matter. It was definitely led by me because I had a really bad marriage to an abusive man.
Yeah, your standard for normal was dysfunctional to begin with, right?
Yes. Right. And as good Christian women, we would never initiate a divorce. So what are our options? Try harder.
Well, I'm going to come back to that. I have a question on that area, but I want to get back to you walk up to your husband with a box of condoms, right? And say, use these. I mean, is there like some sort of an edict against
that one, Seth? This is Vykie.
All right, either one of you. I essentially want to get into, is it like the Catholic Church on crack when it comes to the idea of contraception? Is it evil to use preventative measures when it comes to pregnancy?
It is absolutely evil. It is playing God, because what you're doing there is you are making the decision to prevent a human soul from coming into existence, which God has ordained. And so you are basically, denying life. We talked about being pro-life, and I always called myself radically pro-life. And there's a lot, when it comes to birth control, there is so much misinformation, which we totally bought wholesale because, we're very involved in the pro-life movement. And because of that, we're told that if you use hormonal or artificial birth control, that you're basically causing an abortion every month. Or if you use, it's like every kind of contraception that there might be is basically out. Even natural family planning, we couldn't really go for because, as Nancy Campbell, who's one of the leaders in the movement, she has a ministry called Above Rubies. She says, how natural is it to abstain during that time when a woman is ovulating, because that's the time when she hormonally is more interested in having sex with her husband. And so it's not natural. But what I want to say about that is that the women who are in this, they're the ones who are doing the research, and they're the ones who are getting all this information. And so we come to this point in our mind where we can't even imagine using birth control. And when you talk about, going to your husband and saying, well, this is what I want, if you go to our website, No Longer Quivering, the first thing that people usually notice is that we deliberately misspelled the word quivering. We leave out the U. And our tagline explains that, because it says there is no you in quivering. It is a mindset of such self-denial. You're supposed to die to yourself. There is so much martyrdom involved in this lifestyle and in this mindset that you don't consider, what do I want? What do I care about? What matters to me? You do not enter into the equation. It's all about, what does God want? What does the Bible say?
So sex then is merely an act of procreation. It's not about pleasure or closeness really at all.
Well, that in practicality, that is basically what ends up happening. But I think there's so much idealism there that we're convinced, especially those who are in deeply, they are convinced that sex is this wonderful, amazing gift from God. And if you watch the Duggar family, have you heard of the Duggars?
I have. I've never watched the show, but I've seen.
Yeah, well, Jim Bob and Michelle are notorious for their PDA. They are constantly all over each other. There's this huge controversy right now going on where one of their daughters, who just recently got married, they're saving themselves to the point that they did not kiss before they got married. And so this is a huge thing. Everybody's, the whole world is going to witness their first kiss. And so, and I really applaud their daughter Jenna, who said, was it Jenna or Jessa? One of them, they said, we're going to save our first kiss for, and do it privately. We don't want to kiss on camera for everyone, our first kiss. And that was great. But what happened then, the pastor called up Jim, Bob, and Michelle, the parents, and let them kiss. And they said, now you've seen a Duggar kiss, which is just like, talk about stealing the show, whatever. But then when the daughter did release a photo of her and her husband Ben kissing, it's a very steamy, sexy picture on Instagram, and it just went viral. And I don't know what their thinking was, but Jim, Bob, and Michelle then duplicated that photo of them kissing. I don't know.
It sounds to me like they're entering these relationships completely hamstrung. I mean, they have no real relationship building experience. They haven't touched, they haven't communicated. It's almost like one of those Orthodox marriages where you meet your bride the day before. and
it's basically because they follow the courtship process, which, they say that is the parents, just being intimately involved in choosing a mate, but it really ends up being pretty much an arranged marriage. And so the couple, they go into it and they don't know each other. They don't have any idea, is he a good kisser? Well, he's got lips, I've got lips, and God's going to bless all of that, and it's going to work magically. That's the kind of thinking that they have.
Are we compatible in every way? Well, who knows? We'll find out after we have sealed this relationship under the eyes of God and committed to live the rest of our lives together. That seems like a pretty backward kind of step. I want to get to Jenna real quick, who's been so patient waiting in the background. Mom and Dad regulate dating pretty hard when you were in the house? Did they look wary upon any suitors that might be scratching on the door?
There really was no dating. There was none of that until we escaped. Like, my mom evicted my dad, and we were kind of, like she said, doing the one foot in the Christian homeschooling Quiverfull community and the other in the real world. Not really.
Well, how'd you feel about that? How did it make you feel? Did you think, God, I'm missing out? Or were you a little weird about it and were glad to be free of the responsibility of it? How did you receive all this?
The entire thing was taboo. You didn't talk about feelings or, I like this person or, especially anything sexual. So it just wasn't talked about. And I kind of, I had feelings for one person, and we were together for, I don't know, a month or something, just because it didn't work. He was male. That was the deal. And
well, we're going to have to give us some context there, right? You are not a heterosexual, and that must have been weird for someone who was in the Quiverfull movement as well, right? Because now you're pissing God off on multiple fronts.
Exactly. Well, and I kind of had a realization about that when I was probably 16, again, same time I got out into the real world. And I was like, I'm just a little bit bisexual, maybe. Like, it's just a phase kind of thing, right? And then, no, I just recognized that, no, I'm just really, really gay. And then, by then, we were pretty much done with the Christian homeschooling Quiverfull deal. And, there was no regulation or anything like that. I just kind of did my own thing.
This is Katie, and I'd like to comment on your question to Jenna about dating in the Quiverfull lifestyle. A lot of the patriarchy and the homeschool, the conservative Christian Quiverfull package was following these rules and then having these predicted outcomes. You'd have these perfect children. You'd have not teenagers, but young adults, and they'd all transition perfectly. And when those things didn't happen, we just quietly didn't talk about it. So it was happening in everybody's family. We all had kids that were unruly, but you didn't share that information. In public, they were behaving. And when your teenagers started doing things, and Jenna can probably elaborate on this, they were all told, don't date, don't kiss, remain chaste, don't masturbate, don't look at anything. They were all doing it anyway. they just weren't telling their parents, which of course leads to really awful things when people aren't, teenagers aren't being educated about very natural things that are happening with their bodies. And so there was a lot of secret dating and sex. And then it was always a scandal when one of the kids would get pregnant. And so it was still happening. The kids were still being teenagers, even though we were saying that doesn't happen. And just like Vykie talked about earlier, when there was a failure, I don't know about, maybe Vykie maybe her answer was better, but in my circles, it was never the parents' fault. It wasn't a failure on our side of the method. It was the child's fault.
Yeah, the devil got a hold of Jenna, right?
The sinful heart. And they probably we needed to be more strict with them. And we needed to, just really pull in the reins so they didn't wander even further from the Word of God.
I'm reminded of something, I'm paraphrasing something that Daryl Ray said about how religion makes people feel guilty for what they do naturally, right? Natural desires and inclinations, those are sin. And so they use guilt and shaming as a control device to keep you really in a state of submission constantly. It's tragic. Jenna, did you want to jump in on anything your mom just said?
Other than my relationship with this one kid was a secret. His parents weren't pleased that I, took him out to a movie and kissed him and brought him home. Like, other than that, no, not really.
Is there a concentrated sort of effort in this movement to keep women uneducated, to sort of limit options so that they aren't going to go out and be career people, be professionals, carve a path of their own? Their place is in the home. I'm not talking about people who choose to be a full-time parent, but someone who is there only because all the other options have been roped off. Vykie, did you want to speak to that? Is there any truth to that?
Yes, and of course, the people who are doing this do not, they would not word it that way. They would not say, I am limiting my daughter or keeping, they're constantly saying things like, of course, I want my child, my daughter to have a good education. I want her to have opportunities, etc. But in reality, what they're doing is they put so much emphasis on the utmost importance of fulfilling that role which God designed a woman for, which is motherhood and marriage. And so what we really want to do is we want to prepare her to fulfill that role as best as we possibly can. And so what does that entail? Because you can be a mom without having an advanced degree from a college, but you can't be a mom if you don't know how to change diapers, if you don't know anything about childcare, if you don't know anything about nutrition. And so the emphasis in their education, especially when they're homeschooling, which the majority of them do, is on teaching them these life skills and these domestic abilities to be able to cook, to be able to run a household, to be able to organize and to nurture their. And so what's really interesting about that is it's very convenient for the moms because, if you're having a baby every other year, it really takes a lot out of these women. For myself, there were times where I could not get out of bed. I was just so run down physically from baby after baby and not having time to recover in between. And I had a lot of health issues, which made it literally a life-threatening thing for me to have a baby. And every time I did it, it just wiped me out. But I can't stop. I can't, go convalesce because I have all these other little babies and little children who are dependent on me. And so what happens is you become very dependent on those older daughters. You're training them to be moms themselves, but that training involves, basically raising their younger siblings. And so, it's this kind of this cyclical thing where you believe that the best thing that you can do is train them to be good moms and good wives. And it just happens to work out very nicely that you've got little siblings there for them to practice on.
You mentioned the Duggar family and the television show on TLC. I guess you mentioned it's still on? It's still on the air, is that right?
Yes, I think it's the 8th season.
Yeah, 19 kids and counting. They live in Arkansas. Those are 19 bio children. This woman had 19 kids of her own?
Yes. I always call that show Way Too Many Kids and Counting.
What does that do to a woman's body? I mean, look, I'm on the outside in by far, and I'm thinking, holy shit, that just sounds like it would just be hugely traumatic.
It is very, very hard on a woman's body. And what I find with the women who come, to the Longer Quivering and who they're in this desperate state of health in which they are so run down. They have chronic conditions that have developed because of never getting a break with their body. And so that's one of the first things that has to be addressed, is just getting them enough health. And of course, if you can go several years without being pregnant, that does a lot for being able to recover and to start to get your health back. But for most of us, it is an ongoing thing that we still continue to struggle with health issues.
Was that a common thing in the Quiverfull movement? Children that are born 9 months and 10 minutes apart. Is this a common thing?
My closest were 13 and a half months apart, but it's pretty common because, especially when you're younger and you have that fertility, even if you're breastfeeding, if you're not going to use any birth control, you will get pregnant fairly quickly. And so the children do come fairly, and it's interesting because, scientifically it's been shown that women who have more children are more likely to have twins. So, even twins are a common phenomenon. Michelle Duggar has 2 sets of twins. And so what happens then, because they're so run down physically, there's a huge emphasis in Quiverfull on health and nutrition. And so much of your time is taken up with dieting and with having special meals planned and et cetera. Because also another thing about Quiverfull is that you don't accept any kind of government assistance. You have to do this basically on one income. And so a lot of these women don't have health care. They do not have medical insurance. And because of that, there's a lot of emphasis on the alternative medicine, natural healing kind of thing.
Are we talking midwives coming in to deliver the kids? If you're not insured, how do you handle those expenses?
That was a huge issue for me because my first 3 babies were born by C-section. I had no insurance, and when we made that decision, because after that 3rd C-section, my doctor said, don't do this anymore. Your body can't handle it. And so my husband had a vasectomy, and we were done. But then we got into the whole Quiverfull thing, and we became convicted that we had sinned against God by taking our fertility into our own hands. And we decided that we needed to repent of that, and my husband went and had a reversal. And when that happened, I was like, okay, now I have, if I get pregnant again, how am I going to deliver it? Because I don't have the money for another C-section. And so I planned a home birth, which ended disastrously. That was the worst, most horrific pregnancy and delivery ever. I ended up with an emergency C-section that, really wiped me out. But then I got pregnant again, and same situation, same problem, still no insurance, still no finances to be able to afford my own medical bills. And so I again consulted a midwife, and that one I did deliver at home. Not the smartest thing after 4 C-sections to have a home birth, but that is how, I believed that God was providing for us financially by allowing me to have a home birth. I had really drunk the Kool-Aid to the bottom of the barrel to be able to convince myself that this was a good, godly, healthy thing, that I was going to have my baby at home after 4 C-sections. With my last baby, my 7th, I was actually planning an unassisted home birth because I didn't trust my midwife anymore. Still didn't want to go to the hospital and pay for the delivery. I'd had 2 natural by then. But I thought, okay, I'm out, I'm kind of in the clear now so far as vaginal deliveries go, so I'll just do this one myself. Fortunately, when I actually went into labor, I, for once, actually listened to my own intuition because I felt like something wasn't right. And I said, I just need to go to the hospital, and I did. And I was in the midst of having a uterine rupture. And so, at that time, we almost lost both of us. It's a real problem because women who don't have health coverage and they're having baby, they don't have a lot of options. And so they do seek out some really crazy alternatives.
Well, we've spent some time talking about the problem. Let's sort of turn the corner a little bit and talk about the solution. Katie, you just woke up one day and said, enough? What was your ticket out?
Well, no, it wasn't like that. And I wanted to mention what Vykie said about she was willing to risk her life for these beliefs. And there were times when I put my children at risk that the child could have died because I was following my husband's directives. And I'm always so sympathetic toward these families, like the one recently in Oregon, who let their child die for their religious beliefs because they didn't want to seek medical care. Because it does become, it just spirals out of control. And part of the problem is, and the best way that I've found to describe it to people without going into complete detail is just to describe it like a cult mindset. Because we're not questioning. I had no framework to even put words to what I was experiencing in my marriage and in my life. The word abuse never entered my head. We were so isolated, home churching and homeschooling and surrounding ourselves with like-minded people, that when I would take a problem to another woman and say, my husband is behaving this way, not feeding the children, she would say, oh, it's okay, God will take care of it, or yes, we've struggled with that as well. Or so there was nobody saying or affirming me that, yes, there's something terribly wrong. And so when I eventually evicted my husband, it was this ambiguous feeling. I just thought, something's not right, and it's getting worse. And I don't know what the answer is. And I just said, I need a break, and you need to go. And it wasn't until he was out that I was able to start thinking a little more clearly, just like any abusive relationship, and then gain perspective, do some more research online. It's very difficult. I don't think people understand how much of a cult mindset it is. I think for most people it is a process. They go, there's something wrong. Maybe this method that I've been using, maybe this part needs to go. And so they say, maybe I don't need to have so many kids. I don't feel like I'm really doing the parenting thing very well. And they abandon each part one by one. And that's how it happened with us.
Well, let me ask your daughter, Jenna, how you think your mom's doing? Is she happier these days? More balanced? You want to give me an analysis? You're on the radio?
Absolutely. It's rough being with someone who's so critical of everything. He really was terrible. So being out and being in the real world and seeing how things actually work and what's normal and what's not normal is great. We're doing really, really well considering what we've been through.
Do you find yourself able to encourage other people who are sort of coming out of this whole thing?
I don't actually talk to people who are in the movement still, but
I know you said they're pretty insular, right? They're homeschooling, they're home churching. They definitely are in a bubble. So I guess you would have to really cross paths with them in order to have that kind of interaction.
Mm-hmm. They're very isolated, but occasionally I'll see one of the kids my age coming out and feeling around the real world, and I'm just kind of like, hey, come here, let me talk to you, let me tell you how things work. So yeah, occasionally I'll get that experience, but it doesn't happen very often.
Katie, you get a chance to talk to any sort of ex-Quiverfull moms and just tell them it's okay?
I do, and it's interesting. Vykie and I just had this conversation the other day. I've had several moms come to me that are still living that lifestyle and are saying, if you had it to do all over again, would you do it? Are you happier now? Because they understand that I'm still dealing with my ex-husband. I'm still dealing with custody battles with him. And they have to weigh, do I want to continue in this lifestyle, or at least some semblance of this lifestyle that I'm really, really unhappy with, that my children are unhappy with, or do I want to go live the lifestyle of a normal American family? So, yeah, I've been asked several times. And I know Jenna also, she has friends back from our homeschooling days that she read their blogs, and now they're Facebook friends. And every once in a while she'll come to me and say, do you remember so-and-so, she just did blah, blah, blah thing. And we'll kind of jump up and down and do a little happy dance for a second that a lot of these kids are escaping it. I don't think that the retention rate is what we thought it was going to be when we went in. I think that the Quiverfull movement as a whole, this is just my perspective, and maybe Vykie has a different perspective. Maybe she's aware of better what the statistics are, but I'm not seeing a high retention rate. I'm seeing the second generation is kicking us off and saying, I wasn't happy growing up in this, and I'm not going to continue. I'm not going to perpetuate this with my own family.
All of this leads me to you, Vykie Garrison. Tell me about No Longer Quivering, would you?
Yes, absolutely. Something that is amazingly phenomenal is when you stumble upon another woman who understands what you're talking about and who says, I experienced that too. And that is what No Longer Quivering really has become, is just this place where we can gather together and say, we weren't crazy. This was wrong. This was harmful, but we understand how we got there. Maybe not completely and certainly not perfectly, but we have a really good idea of what led to such an extreme lifestyle and being able to, just talk with people and start to process that and to be able to say, to meet people who are in various stages of the journey of getting out. And it is a journey. It is definitely a process that does not happen all at once. Like Katie said, you take a baby step. I don't do most of the posting on No Longer Quivering anymore. I have another former Quiverfull mom who does that and who does the moderation of the comments. But I like to read through, and when I see somebody who is just coming out, I like to catch them, and I invite them to our little private support group. We can start having, a conversation and discussing and saying, here's what's going on. And so a lot of what is happening as far as support is going on behind the scenes, especially among the second generation. I call them kids, but a lot of them are in their late 20s, early 30s at this point. And they come and they start reading. There's another blog, Lovejoy Feminism, which was started by a woman who is the oldest of 12, and she started writing and started blogging. And, that's become quite a community, too, for those kids to be able to come and say, just to be able to talk to somebody else who has never seen all the Disney movies or who wasn't allowed to watch Harry Potter or read the books, and to be able to say, yeah, I didn't date either, or I understand having to always wear dresses and how I didn't feel modest in those dresses. I felt like a sticking out like a sore thumb kind of thing. And so just to be able to relate and to be able to get that support is really phenomenal. It is turning lives around and giving people a lot of hope, because when you get so insular in a mindset to where you can't even imagine any other perspective, they call it a biblical worldview, and it really is all-encompassing, and it's to the point where every detail of your life, you have chapter and verse. It's so black and white, and you can't even comprehend an outside perspective. And so the thought of getting out is terrifying, because you're in this position where you know you can't continue. It's a totally unsustainable lifestyle, and everything is falling apart. But what alternative is there? What else are you going to do? And so to be able to talk to people who, are farther along in that process, and they can say, actually, it's rather amazing. We're having a great time. I love my kids way more now than I did when they were just these little arrows in God's army. When they had to be perfect, and I had to be perfect, and everything had to be perfect. Now we can just be real. And it's so much, the pressure is off, and we're loving life, we're enjoying life, and the world is not that scary. That's something that Jenna mentioned, that we had all these fears of everything that was just so bad for us, and Satan was, behind everything. But when you get out in the world and you start to experience these things, and you see that it's not actually as terrifying as you were led to believe, it's kind of fun.
You are no longer quivering, indeed. What's the website if people were curious and wanted to find out more about it?
We are hosted on the spirituality channel of Papios, but if you just type nolongerquivering.com, you'll be redirected to that site.
And I will put a link in the description box. Thank you for allowing us to sort of get educated about what this is and the whole culture. And, if I may say so, I know, Katie, I know you got a dozen kids, but, I just want you to adopt me. You just sound like you just sound like a keeper. And then, Jen and I could be siblings, and then Aunt Vykie could come over and we'll.
All right. It was a party, right? Because we can have rum and Coke now.
I love it. We'll call it communion. That sounds like my kind of deal. Katie Webb, Jenna Bettendorf, and Vykie Garrison, thank you so much for being a part of today's broadcast, for your perspectives, and for the great work you are doing out there. And all my best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Now that the show is over, don't forget to support this broadcast by logging on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Forget the vending machine. You can snack smarter with delicious treats like Chipotle maple almonds. And right now you can sign up to get your free sampler box. So check it out, naturebox.com/thinkingatheist.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.